one of the things that the founder of our nation, the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi said, therefore I'm calling it Gandhiism, he said that if really we carry on at the way that the West is industrializing the world, God forbid that India should ever take an industrialization to this type of industrialization after the manner in which the West has done. He said the economic imperialism of a single tiny island nation like the UK is today keeping the world in chains in an entire nation, of 300 million took to similar economics exploitation. It would strip the world bare of its locus. Now, these words in 2020 seem to be coming true. I'm saying just post-COVID. And really, 300 million was the population of India then. And now we are 1.3 billion. It just shows really what growth of human population is. Not that we want to stop it, but that itself has contributed greatly to the challenges posed of utilization of the resources that wonderful Mother Earth gives us. I think economic exploitation, we can put all kinds of figures, but I think that the world's really value of $200 trillion is very well represented by nature. And I think despite what the challenges may be in terms of the services methodology for valuing economy, I think it's very important to understand that we have in some way created a problem which I don't think there's going back for, despite all the science and technology. And that's called zoonotic diseases. By reducing forests, we're reducing a whole lot of subspecies, subsystems, meaning all kinds of sort of animals just like us. We're reducing them, and in the process, we are using them in a way which is causing more challenges, and therefore the start of zoonotic diseases, which started many years ago, at least we have measured it many years ago, whether it's SARS and now COVID. But COVID, the good news about COVID is it's brought a realization on people to say that there are blue skies, there is clean water, there is less pollution, and therefore COVID's opportunities is what we are actually presenting in Balipara Foundation. We, in this foundation, are trying to debate and understand and be challenged in what we are saying. Neither am I an economist, nor am I an ecologist, but I do understand that, to have economy balancing a good ecology is just that much more pleasant. We see this in the trends of travel post-COVID. I think people do like the sea, people do like the mountains, people do like greenery. And I think we should sort of respect that. And I think we should work around the challenges of working towards what I would call a more ecologically balanced economy. And an ecologically balanced economy has numbers and values. And that's what we've put. We have a concept called the LEWAC, which is land, energy, waste, water, air, and carbon. But that is very deeply embedded in our rural areas. And somehow the whole world and the whole West has led us into this whole business of saying that, urbanization, it is. So we have an urban renewal mission, but we don't have a rural renewal mission. Yet, both in terms of a democracy and otherwise, our vote bank lies in rural areas. So we've created what is called the rural futures. We believe there are three elements, and I'm sure there must be many more, that if there is good education in rural areas, and by good I mean wholesome, substantive, it doesn't have to be follow a norm which we are used to of class 10 and 11. I think we will be able to sort of create a different kind of dynamic. That dynamic, along with the dynamic of good healthcare, available healthcare in terms of diagnostics and therefore treatment, I think would be the second. And the third would be very important to create employment. And I just believe that this whole employment capacity of using the natural assets to create natural capital would actually be much more than the employment that we are actually attracting into cities. I believe that the natural asset process of creating natural assets is just one. Instead of saying urbanization is about making building, in terms of natural asset creation, we're talking about rewilding the economy. We're saying rewilding the economy because we're still using the word economy and for lack of any other word. But I believe that this will give rise to the employment through what I would call, what is popularly called as green jobs, but I would call it rural jobs, and agroforestry and renewables seem to be the way. By 2030, if we did that, I think we will be well on our way towards creating net zero. And actually the dependency on fossil fuels, etc., will be reduced. All leading companies seem to be sort of signing up to this mantra of net zero. The dependency on enhancing infrastructure efficiency and investing in nature-based solutions for carbon sequestration seem to be.
Having missed the industrial buzz, we thought that what is the advantage that you have? And the biggest advantage we have is in fact nature. And I think this natural paradise that we have, we need to actually work on it. So that's how this whole Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum arrived.
So tell us, Ranjit, you have to tell me, how do we define naturenomics? What does that mean?
Naturenomics is a very simple definition. It's the interdependence between nature and economics. There's no big formula to it. So if nature and economics is together, then if you look at any coin, you'll see two sides to the coin. So, but the coin is one. So this coin is one, economics and
okay, so what should one expect over now? You're having 5 days of sessions. It's culminating in a foundation award ceremony in which you're recognizing a lot of entrepreneurial social work coming out of the Eastern Himalayas. What's in store over the next 5 days?
Well, we have a framework of sort of ideas that we are playing out. And the framework of ideas really is to manage our objectives during this period. And the objective is nothing but what I would call, like they say, cash neutral and ecologically neutral output for everything that we do. We have 5 elements to this. One is the 5 elements that we talk around the whole conference is land, energy, waste, water, air, and carbon. So if you really look at it, this LEVAC concept that we developed, which actually goes into as the inputs to naturenomics valuation and methodology, we find that that's really what we're going to discuss. So we've got thinkers, doers. Are they big names? Many of them are big names, if not all of them, in their own field, in their own sphere, and in their own geographies. So there's nobody who's unimportant, especially the people, the indigenous communities who are participating. So
okay, and the interesting facts, of course, and I'd like to point out to viewers, you can tune this you can register and record registrations, Ranjit ji has told me, have already come in. So for the limited seats available, you can register online, and the details, of course, are constantly flashing at the bottom of your screens right here on NewsX. Okay, Ranjit ji, now since I've got your undivided attention, I know it's a busy evening for you ahead of this conclave, but let's discuss the big ideas. The first big idea is about reimagining ecological assets. Now, for people watching this broadcast, we hold gold reserves, forex reserves, and those gold reserves and forex reserves become a measure of national wealth. Ranjit Barthakur, how do we make ecological assets a measure of national wealth?
I don't think it's very difficult, but I think it's complex, given that anybody who's an economist or anybody who's actually created the structure of measurement of the world and is doing well is based on GDP, which is really the gross domestic product and anything that comes out thereof. In fact, when Adam Smith did his Wealth of Nations talked about everything, labor, productivity, and everything around it, which was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. I think time has come when you need to remeasure what is really the wealth of nations, and that's called the natural wealth of nations. And the natural wealth of nations is nothing but the ecological assets that we have. And these ecological assets, let's give a small example of trees. If Arunachal had to take all the trees and just count how many trees they had and just weighed the different ages and said, okay, different ages, there's a different value to the tree, because a full-grown teak tree, which is 70 years or 80 years old, is weighing 100 tons. Compared to a teak tree, which is 2 tons, which is much smaller. If we added all this and we just did a calculation, if we sold it as just teak and timber, how much money would we get? So if we had 1 trillion trees of full value, there may be $1 trillion economy. So all we're saying is $1 trillion, meaning is the value of the trees in Arunachal, should there be 1 trillion trees of the weight and height of a full-grown teak tree. So all the other trees together.
Let's say we are able to do the valuation. So what you're saying is that so far the timber only has a value after it's cut. You're saying value it while it stands.
Absolutely.
And then that gives you an endemic understanding of a natural reserve, much like a gold reserve that you're holding in trust.
Absolutely.
Now, once we do this, how do we then develop an economic model around this? Can I then say that, okay, IMF, World Bank, I'm holding $1 trillion in natural assets. I want to borrow off that rather than cutting it down?
I think that's exactly the point. You've described it better than I could. The reality is that if you had $1 trillion value worth of a gold reserve, you would basically borrow against it. If you had foreign exchange of that, you'd borrow against it. So if you have $1 trillion worth of natural reserves, there's no reason in this world where borrowing and hypothecation and mortgaging, etc., as debt mechanisms are so standard in what they do, is that you could actually take borrowed money against natural capital, natural assets, and that would be called natural capital.
What a fascinating, and then you could actually have equity markets, bond market, derivative markets, that this could become a standing reserve. And this would, of course, encourage people, because literally your ecological assets are as important as the gold in the RBI.
Completely. That is one. But coming back to the question you asked, I think really what I think we want to do, the economic model moves a little ahead and says, so if there is all the people around that, what are the activities which we call would give them a better life, that they're not eaten by mosquitoes or by animals. So we say, okay, meaning we would like to have a very good sort of infrastructure system, an infrastructure which supports meaning ecological growth around it. 2 is we'd have very good education up there, and we would have excellent healthcare, and we'd have excellent employment opportunities. So if you really look at it, if the rural sort of departments, which we in Nationomics call rural futures. The rural futures is the valuation, just as you have financial market futures and commodity futures. You would actually be able to value and weigh the natural assets that you have, the natural capital that you have, and the rural future development index that you can develop out of the funds from there. And any surplus could be lent to any neighboring state or any neighboring organization or country, political country that we may.
So the assets become monetized, they become virtual, they become tradable.
Yes.
You're looking at a very basic footprint that carbon trading has taught us over the past decade or so at a completely whole different level. Okay, so that's idea number 1. Ranjit Barthakur, I know you're working already on idea number 2, is to have the first ecological financial budget of India. What does this mean?
So, meaning one of the things that I did ask the head of the Planning Commission, the CEO, and I did ask this to the Finance Minister and Assam, who are both very sort of dynamic sort of thinkers, is that what do you all think that if we actually, why are we presenting a financial budget where we don't have control of, or we don't have everything measurable, which is linked only to the world and to a system which was born in Adam Smith's sort of Scotland and led to Bretton Woods and then onwards, which is really controlled by others, to say that you actually have, this is the ecological budget, I'm the ecological and finance minister. This is the nature of the wealth that we have. So the nature of wealth is actually the natural wealth of nations, of any nation. So it's not the wealth of nations, but the natural wealth of nations. So the natural wealth of nations will talk about, say, what is the fresh water that we have running in the Brahmaputra River? If the fish in the river has no value, only it's on the table and when it goes to the market it's got, we've got so much fish, we've got so many butterflies if that is valued. And there is a way to value bees and butterflies, by the way, because of the pollination and what they grow. So if we start doing that, you present the ecological budget first and say, this is the state of the nation, assets that we have. Now, this is the expenditure that we have. This expenditure, one is for agriculture, one is for education, one is for healthcare. Everything else is presented there based on the ecological budget. Our borrowings and everything else will be superimposed to the borrowings and lending of not just the natural capital that you have and the natural assets, but to the current financial market assets and liabilities that you may want to do. So I think that's really where it is.
What kind of scale of exercise would this require? Because this requires imagination, not only in this country, and this country could well become the pioneer of it, but what kind of scale of exercise would this actually require to reimagine the worldscape like this?
I think there are people already working in the world. If we had a financial sort of framework in which we actually work these budgets, we are used to it. So therefore we tweak it and say this country is doing well or not well. I believe this entire exercise requires people like we have been working with from Yale University, from Oxford, Cambridge, London School of Economics, Delhi University, and also universities back here, and Kunming University, surprise, surprise, in China. And we've tried to actually weigh a model by which how do you actually weigh these natural assets? And really, a company which is an extractive technology, and most companies do that, they extract, but what do they give back? They give back a lot to society, education, healthcare and all, but what are they doing to restore its basic assets? So if you have a house, if you break parts of the house and redo it, then you're redoing it. But if you break parts of the house and leave it and say, no, we're taking one floor and putting it in the second floor, then your house is depreciated. So I believe conceptually, that's the model that we're talking about. How do we take assets which exist? How do we take assets if multiplied and sold? What is the monetizable value?
So like I said, advanced, carbon trading, because if a company is repurposing or redeveloping the assets it has exhausted, that's not some sort of CSR activity anymore. That is then assets going back into the company's balance sheets, because those plants or those trees or that natural scape will regrow over a period of time and then become an asset. What have we learned? If we have a real world example for people watching the broadcast, Ranjit ji, in the changing economic systems that are happening in Arabia right now, moving away from the reality that the oil economy, we are probably getting past it in the next couple of decades.
I think in UAE, at least where I noticed, and we've got the head of their economic department also part of the show. In fact, two people. I went and saw what they did. First is they did ecosystem restorations in three areas. One is the area of mangroves. Two is in the area of flamingos and flamingo nesting, not necessarily in mangroves. And the third, they did a very important thing. They looked at the oceans. And they said, if we can keep our oceans clean and if we can actually use the oceans to regenerate the entire fish and delivery system from there, and also use that water for the entire desalination plants that they have, that would actually add real value. So one is they're looking at restoring the ecological assets as on land and water, which is really very relevant. Two, they're saying that why can't we become actually, even though we are desertified as a process of geological evolution, is that we can still have actually a whole tourism industry around desertification, mangroves, sea, etc., etc. So they've actually converted from taking the oil money, they've done infrastructure, and they've created the infrastructure of ecological infrastructure, and so that they can actually promote not just tourism, but give livelihoods to people around that.
Okay, Ranjit ji, the sustainable economy in terms of entrepreneurs now engaging in creating solutions, services, and products that are sustainable. Now you're recognizing several such work in the award that you'll be giving out in about 4 or 5 days' time. But has that reached a breakaway point? Is it still niche, or are you seeing some rapid momentum now emerging in the sheer number of products, entrepreneurs who have what we call a social rate of return, but still are providing economic value, making a profit.
I think that entire segment of what I would call economic activity is still very minuscule. I don't think it has reached an inflection point to take off. And I don't think it is as yet disrupting the current delivery system, because the entire delivery system mechanism has to be revalued. So if transportation, and it's not necessarily only carbon, it is if transportation itself is actually destroying or harming the entire process of movement of goods and services and taking away value, we have not been able to reinvent that. But what definitely seems to be happening in rural areas, there's much more need for them to use the assets that are in the forests. And therefore, our community development program, it's not that we're doing it for communities, but communities are doing it for us, are saying that if you look at the asset class that we have in the forest, we have a medicinal class, medicinal forest, we have all growing all over. Then we have a food class, which is doing food for everything. Then we have a class of assets which actually feeds say from elephants right down to all the other carnivores like deer and insects and things like that. So that's another asset class. And then we have an asset class, which is the economic asset class. The long-term economic asset class, which is say a teak wood, which needs 60 to 70 years. We also have bamboo and we have cane, which is much faster. And bamboo and cane are somehow providing a whole new ethos in terms of food, in terms of clothing, in terms of mechanism. And they say bamboo well processed is better, the tensile strength is better than that of steel. So if you look at it, the asset class seems to be defined now. And if asset class gets defined, then you start saying, okay, how do we use that as asset class and what's the value chain of this asset class? So I think it is still emerging and developing. Till you have a valuation system of natural assets, it's unlikely that this will go to the center of the activity of economics. And unless this goes to the center, it won't happen.
Yeah, so let me ask you on that question. Naturenomics. So where do we come or translate this from an idea into something that is normalized, ubiquitous, which means if you're studying economics, by the very definition, you're studying naturenomics. If you are writing a paper, if you're applying for a job in the World Bank or joining the finance ministry, this is where your grounding has been. What needs to be done for it to become ubiquitous?
I still come back. The first thing is that we have to agree that nature has value. Once that it comes to we mainstream that in the Planning Commission, and as you will see in the session, Amitabh Kant has said that it should be, definitely and would be. And he said the Prime Minister of India is definitely pushing it. And you'll see a quote from the Prime Minister of India saying the same thing. We'll see all the Northeastern Chief Ministers seem to be saying the same thing. So I think the movement has started, the train has left the station. What really is the problem is that while this is now getting to be a little fashionable, it has not really got teeth on it. And so to your point, naturenomics can only be valued provided we do the model based on land, energy, waste, water, air, and carbon. These are the only elements. You can put any variations of these elements, but till we don't put figures on it, we can't. So we've done an exercise, and we've done that exercise with actually support and guidance from our mentor, Lord Nick Stern of London School of Economics. And we've worked out that suppose there was a 10,000 acre worth of land. We found out that what was on the land before an industry starts. And then we worked out what is land degradation economically, forget nature-wise. Then we said, what was the water? Are they water surplus or water negative? Then we put a value on that. Then we said energy. Are they actually challenging the world with fossil fuels or coal? Or are they actually getting sort of their source of supplies, say solar, which is really not on the earth, but off the earth? And then we've got waste. What do they do with their waste? Are they net zero in terms of waste? And what are they doing in terms of their policies to net zero? And the world is moving towards net zero 2030, 2040 and 50, including a company like Reliance, who we've quoted Mr. Ambani, who's actually sort of talked about net zero, and we've been inspired by what he says on water. Mr. Tata has talked about. And then in terms of the entire schematic, we've had people like Mr. Chandrasekhar, the head of TCS. All these people have made presentations to say what it is. So I think we've been able to gather the pieces together. Is it still it is still a long shot theory, 100%. Is it moving off the shelf? Maybe 0.1%. When are we likely to have a framework which is measurable and doing? I think once the big guys that we've excited get involved in it, which I think in the next 1 or 2 years, we will have a framework which will measure whether a company is doing well for the nation, well for humanity or not. And I think that is very...
I think this is the 8th year of our awards. We've done about 160 to 120 awards, and it's been fantastic sort of reception. It's a reception of the people, by the people, and for the people. So it's been unbelievable. And I just think in this year's theme of ecology is economy, we found even more people and more geographies to include. I think at this stage, the globe, as we have seen in this conference, has been highlighted to be under threat, and this threat has been caused by man himself. I believe that we in Balipara Foundation wanted to achieve 3 very important macro themes, and I think we have been relatively successful in addressing them. We think there is a call for a nationwide evaluation of natural assets, starting with the Eastern Himalayas, because we really feel that it will be easier to do, and this becomes the case study not just for India, but for the world. I think we also are mooting the idea that if all the ministers of the Eastern Himalayas, which also includes Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar, create the first ecological ecological finance budget, instead of just the finance budgets for the year. I think, and lastly, our pet subject, which is naturenomics, how do we create this interdependent model for every activity that the individual and government does, which has a public interface, for evaluating of this interdependence and actually thinking about how we create the impact which really must end up in a positive light for creating a very healthy financial future, but more important, a very healthy ecological future. Because if there is no ecology, there is no finance. We also believe that in supporting the theme of ecology is economy, we have to invest in what we call natural assets, because it's only through natural assets do we actually create natural capital, and the only way to form natural assets, the best way to form natural assets, is in fact rewilding the Eastern Himalayas. I think through that flows through a very high employment potential, and in fact this with agroforestry and renewables supported by natural skills and education would address the social impact that may be required to keep the rural areas up and running. By 2030, I also believe, given that we missed the industrial bus, we should be able to move towards net zero. And more importantly, what we should be able to do is create an entire framework for rural India, if not rural Eastern Himalayan naturenomics geography, with a kind of framework with components which will be able to benefit all human beings, equally benefit all biodiversity and bioorganisms in any form or any shape. We don't believe that reviewing in the last 4 days